Amara Johnson's entrance into Ridgeview Middle School was as quiet as her voice. Unnoticed at first except for her skin, her stillness, and her posture, which to some looked timid, but to the observant looked more like the controlled breath of a storm held in check. She walked into homeroom in the middle of the semester with her shoulders back, her chin level, and her eyes lowered not in shame, but in the practiced calm of someone who had long ago learned the power of silence. And while the teacher gave a brief, obligatory introduction that barely skimmed her name and hometown, she didn't offer more, instead scanning the rows of desks with a stillness that unsettled some of the louder kids in the back, especially Bryce, the self-proclaimed king of the 8th grade jungle, and Heather, his equally loud, entitled shadow, whose interest was piqued by Amara's refusal to play the nervous new girl act they'd seen 100 times before. Ridgeview was the kind of school where cliques ran deep and invisible walls marked the difference between the popular and the peripheral, the loud and the unheard. And Amara, with her soft dark braids neatly tied and her uniform crisp and clean, was immediately marked as different in a school where different often became a target, especially when that difference came wrapped in melanin, quiet confidence, and a refusal to bow to the unwritten rules of middle school survival. It didn't take long before the whispers started. Where's she from? Why doesn't she talk? Is she stuck up? Why does she eat lunch alone? And those whispers grew louder when Amara kept her distance, not out of fear, but because she didn't need to belong to anyone else's group to validate who she was. While others giggled in packs or jostled for popularity points, Amara read quietly under the old oak tree during lunch, sipped water slowly from her thermos, and walked the hallways like someone who knew who she was without needing anyone's permission, which is exactly what irked Bryce, because for kids like him, control wasn't just about being liked. It was about being feared, about everyone playing the game he dictated, and Amara's refusal to react threatened that. Heather, who thrived on being queen of mean, tried subtle jabs at first, calling Amara's braids snakes and asking in a voice loud enough to echo, "Do you even know what conditioner is?" To which Amara offered no reply, just a glance. That made Heather blink faster than she wanted to. Bryce escalated by accidentally bumping into her in the hall, knocking her books out of her hands, and when Amara simply bent to pick them up without flinching or snarling or bursting into tears like so many others had. It unsettled him more than if she'd screamed, because silence is dangerous when you can't predict what's behind it. What none of them knew, none of them could have imagined, is that Amara's silence was not a shield of weakness, but the sharpened result of years of discipline, hours of training before and after school in a small garage where her mother, a decorated taekwondo black belt and former national champion, drilled her with a love as fierce as it was disciplined. Block. Turn, breathe, react without ego, fight without rage, control the body by mastering the mind. And Amara, who had known the sting of being underestimated for her skin, her gender, her quiet, took each lesson as scripture, knowing that the greatest strength was not in the ability to strike, but in the restraint to wait for the right moment. Each day after school, while Ridgeview's kids gossiped over soda or played video games, Amara changed into her dobok and stepped barefoot into the mat-lined garage, where her mother waited not with softness, but with the iron patience of a warrior-turned-coach, correcting every stance, calling out every missed beat, demanding focus, and instilling in her daughter not just the moves, but the mindset of a fighter who defends with purpose and never attacks from pride. At school, Amara bore the microaggressions, the muttered slurs, the side-eyes, the lunchroom whispers, and the whispered, "Why's her nose so wide?" And "She thinks she's better than us," with the same stillness she used in her breathing. Drills, absorbing each insult like the blow of a padded strike, not internalizing it but measuring it, storing it, not for revenge but for readiness, because her mother had taught her, "You never look for the fight, Amara. But if it comes, to you, you end it fast and clean." And those words became her compass, her armor, her creed. So when Bryce, frustrated by his inability to get a rise out of her, began turning up the pressure, pushing her books onto the floor again, calling her mute girl, daring her to speak during group presentations only to laugh when she did. So with eloquence and clarity, Amara felt no shame, only a growing awareness that these weren't bullies in power, they were cowards in costume, and though she didn't want confrontation, she began to sense it might be inevitable. She noticed other students watching her, especially those who were often ignored. The chubby kid in the back with the notebook full of drawings, the shy girl who always stayed silent in class, the kid who stuttered and got mocked behind his back. These students began to look at Amara with something more than curiosity. They saw in her a quiet defiance, a dignity that hadn't been stripped away, and they began to nod at her in the hallways, small acknowledgements that said, "We see you," even if they never said it aloud. But the popular kids saw it too, and Bryce, who lived for control, sensed he was losing his grip. Amara's refusal to play the victim was disrupting his power, and he hated it. One rainy Thursday, after a gym period where Amara had calmly outpaced most of the class in a sprint, without boasting or even seeming winded, Bryce cornered her outside the locker room and whispered, "You think you're better than us?" To see, which Amara simply raised her eyebrows and walked past him, which infuriated him more than any insult could have. That night, Amara trained harder, sensing the air shifting, knowing the moment might come soon when her patience would be tested, when she would be called to defend not her pride, but her boundaries. Her mother, noticing the intensity in her daughter's strikes, asked nothing, only nodded with approval and adjusted her form. "Stay focused, baby," she said. "It's not about the fight. It's about knowing who you are when the fight finds you." And Amara, breathing deep, bowed her head and whispered, "Yes, ma'am." In the classroom, she remained polite, quiet, and distant. In the hallway, she stepped aside when others pushed past her, but never with lowered eyes. In the cafeteria, she sat alone but tall, eating her food slowly while others laughed at her solitude. And in the locker room, when girls tried to joke about her body, her hair, her skin tone, she remained unmoved, radiating a dignity that unnerved them more than any comeback could. She was not waiting for their approval. She was waiting for something else. She was waiting for the line to be crossed. As the weeks passed, frustration curdled into something darker in the hearts of Bryce and Heather, the self-proclaimed rulers of Ridgeview Middle School's social caste, who couldn't understand why Amara Johnson's silence stung more than a scream, why her refusal to break made them feel smaller each time they tried to reduce her, and so they escalated, not with fists or screams, but with the cunning cruelty that middle school bullies specialize in, the subtle assaults that teachers rarely catch and administrators too often ignore. It began with her books being accidentally kicked across the hallway floor when she walked by, then forgetting to include her in group projects, followed by a slow vandalizing of her locker, where they scribbled words like mute, voodoo girl, and robot, always with just enough ambiguity to escape punishment, always just short of direct confrontation, because cowards rarely confront power directly, and though they didn't yet know what they sensed, Bryce and Heather were beginning to feel that something about Amara was dangerous in a way they couldn't explain. When rumors began flying, whispers about her being weird, about her not speaking because she was hiding something, about her maybe being violent, crazy, or haunted, Amara heard it all but responded with the same graceful quiet, a kind of quiet that wasn't emptiness but fullness held in check, and her lack of reaction only fueled their obsession. Her calm became a mirror they couldn't stop looking into, one that reflected their own insecurity, and in that reflection, they saw not power but desperation, a truth that pushed them to orchestrate something bigger, louder, more humiliating. Meanwhile, Amara moved through the days like a wave gliding just beneath the surface, unbothered but observant, her eyes soaking up every move, every whisper, every signal, cataloguing the betrayals not with bitterness, but with precision, just as her mother had taught her, because to know your opponent is not to hate them, but to study their rhythm, and Amara, for all her youth, understood rhythm better than most warriors twice her age. But even with the abuse rising, she told no one, not the guidance counselor with the forced smile who only asked once how she was adjusting, not the homeroom teacher who often turned a blind eye to hallway mischief, and not even her mother, who she knew would demand answers, perhaps even storm the school with righteous fury. Amara bore it all in silence, not out of shame, but out of resolve, because she believed deeply in choosing her moment, in measuring the line that must never be crossed, and knowing that when it came, she would recognize it. Yet the school around her wasn't blind, not entirely. Other students, those who lived in the shadows of the popular clique, began to notice her more intently, watching the way she moved like wind through a crowded hallway, the way her gaze cut clean and unflinching when Bryce jeered or Heather mocked. And slowly, wordlessly, the outsiders began gravitating toward her. The girl with the stutter who stopped eating lunch in the bathroom and sat near Amara under the oak tree. The quiet boy with hearing aids who had been shoved into lockers more times than he could count, but now found himself drawn to the calm energy she radiated. The Latino twins, who were always ignored despite their talent, and who now offered shy smiles in her direction during gym class. They didn't speak much. Amara didn't invite conversations, but something in her discipline, in her unwillingness to perform pain for their entertainment, gave them courage, made them feel seen. Not in a loud movie scene way, but in the way a tree quietly offers shade. Still, the bullies noticed this too, how their social gravity was weakening, how Amara's silence was becoming a center of strength for others, and so Bryce and Heather planned what they believed would be the final blow, the kind of public humiliation that would break her spirit or force her to lash out and finally get punished, ruining her reputation for good. The plan was simple and cruel. They'd corner her after school in the alleyway that led to the back gate near the park, where no teachers patrolled, where the camera they brought could capture it all, her being mocked, shoved, reduced, and then they'd post it online, spin the narrative, claim she attacked first if needed, and retake their throne as masters of middle school power. What they didn't know, what they could never imagine, was that Amara had already seen it coming. She had noticed the way they started whispering when she walked past, the glances toward the alley, the way Heather's backpack seemed too full for a Tuesday, and how Bryce had started carrying a phone charger when he never cared about his battery before. Her training had taught her to watch more than she spoke, to study the patterns of threat the way one studies the timing of a sparring opponent, when they breathe before a strike, when their shoulder tightens, when their posture shifts. And Amara, sensing the gathering storm, prepared not in fear but in focus. She adjusted her walk, studied her exit routes, timed her pace to meet the moment, and that afternoon, as the bell rang and the building spilled its tired students into the world, she walked deliberately toward the alley, not as prey walking into a trap, but as a lion stepping into the den, ready. As she turned the corner into the narrow passage framed by brick and broken concrete, she saw them, Bryce, Heather, and two others who hovered behind them with nervous laughter, unsure whether this was a joke or something more. But Amara's eyes were locked, her breathing even, her senses sharpened to a singular clarity. Bryce stepped forward first, smug and overconfident, phone already in hand, recording. "Hey, quiet girl," he sneered. "Still too good to talk to us?" Heather giggled, circling like a hyena. "Maybe if we mess up your hair, you'll finally scream." The others laughed, but there was hesitation in their voices, a crack in the performance. Amara said nothing. She dropped her backpack slowly, deliberately, letting it land with a thud on the ground, and turned to face them squarely. Heather reached for her arm. That's when Amara moved, not with rage, not with wild panic, but with the speed and grace of muscle memory trained over years, her body flowing from stillness to motion in one seamless arc. She sidestepped Heather's grab, pivoted on the ball of her foot, and used Heather's own forward momentum to guide her down, gently but firmly, flipping her onto the ground with a maneuver that looked effortless, but was born of endless repetition. Bryce blinked in shock, stepping back, but Amara was already in motion, ducking low to avoid a clumsy swing from the second boy, using his imbalance to nudge him sideways into the wall, where he crumpled in confusion. Bryce lunged, camera still, in hand, but Amara blocked his wrist with a clean parry, twisted and forced him to drop the phone, which clattered to the concrete and cracked. Then she froze, breathing steady, eyes calm, her stance defensive but unmoving, as the dust settled and all three bullies found themselves on the ground or backed into corners, stunned, winded, and utterly without answers. "Stop!" Heather shrieked, scrambling backward. "We were just playing," Bryce wheezed, clutching his wrist. "She's crazy!" But Amara didn't speak. She didn't need to. A few students had gathered at the end of the alley, drawn by the noise, and one had filmed the whole thing, not from the angle Bryce planned, but from one that showed everything. The setup, the threats, the attack, and Amara's unshakable self-defense. As teachers came running and the crowd grew, Amara calmly picked up her bag, nodded once at the onlookers and walked away, leaving behind the wreckage not of a brawl, but of illusion shattered. She hadn't fought because she was angry. She had acted because the line had been crossed, and now the truth was out, not just the truth of what Bryce and Heather were, but the truth of who Amara Johnson really was. The next morning dawned with a different kind of silence at Ridgeview Middle School, not the sleepy murmur of another routine Wednesday, but the kind of hush that hovers when something seismic has shifted beneath everyone's feet. And though the halls bustled and lockers clanged as usual, the students moved with a strange energy, as if the air itself buzzed with something unspoken yet undeniably electric, because what had happened after school in that alley the day before had already begun to spread like wildfire, not as whispers but as video clips, shared in hushed awe under desks, reposted on private group chats, and re-uploaded by students who weren't even there but had heard the story retold a dozen times by morning. Amara Johnson, the new quiet black girl, had taken down the school's top bullies with the calm of a monk and the precision of a warrior, and not out of anger, not in chaos, but in a way that stunned everyone into questioning what power really looked like. Some thought the video must have been edited, slowed down or manipulated somehow, because no one that calm, that small, that quiet should have been able to move like that, dodging Bryce's punch as if she saw it before it came, flipping Darren with one fluid motion that seemed impossible without wires or stunt doubles, stepping away from Heather's grab like water slipping through fingers, never once lashing out in rage, but simply neutralizing, redirecting, dismantling. And when the camera zoomed in on her face after the chaos, it wasn't anger or fear that people saw, but control, deep and practiced, the look of someone who had been preparing for far more than schoolyard taunts. Students who had never noticed Amara before now watched her from afar in the hallways, not with pity or scorn like they had weeks ago, but with curiosity, respect, and something else. Reverence, maybe, or the unsettling realization that there was a kind of quiet power living among them that none of them had understood. The bullies, meanwhile, were nowhere to be seen. Bryce's sprained wrist and bruised ego kept him home. Heather claimed she had a stomach flu, and the others had gone strangely silent, no longer mocking or pushing or preening for attention, because nothing kills a performance faster than being exposed, and nothing feels colder than the silence of those who once laughed with you, now laughing at your defeat. Amara walked through the building like she always did, head high, shoulders relaxed, bag slung across her back, but something had changed in the way space opened for her, how people stepped aside without realizing it, not out of fear but out of something deeper. Respect born not of dominance but dignity. Teachers had seen the video too, most trying to act like they hadn't, though their glances lingered a bit longer, and Principal Hawthorne called her to the office not to discipline, but to ask in a half-confused, half-impressed tone whether everything was all right at home, to which Amara replied simply, "Yes, sir," because she understood that his question wasn't about home at all, but about how a girl like her had done what she did without blinking. She didn't offer details. No mentions of early morning training in her backyard with her mother, a retired taekwondo instructor who had taught Amara not just how to move, but when not to, how to breathe through fear, how to become water under pressure, and most importantly, how to never fight for pride, only for peace. She didn't speak of the tournaments she'd skipped this year to help her mom transition careers, or the medals collecting dust in a shoebox under her bed, because Amara never needed people to clap for her victories, only to understand her limits, and that her silence had never been permission, only patience. Word of what happened didn't stay confined to Ridgeview either. By the third day, local news outlets had picked up the story, thanks to a viral post from a student's older sibling captioned, "When the quiet girl has hands and morals." The clip had already hit over 300,000 views, sparking a wave of commentary, some praising her restraint, others debating school violence and self-defense, some missing the point entirely. But what mattered most was that the story wasn't about a fight. It was about a lesson, and people could feel that. For once, it wasn't just a sensational headline. It was a portrait of dignity under attack and discipline under fire. Meanwhile, Amara's small circle had begun to grow. People who once sat alone now gravitated to the table beneath the oak tree where she preferred her lunch breaks. The stuttering girl named Myra now giggled easily at Amara's dry humor. The hearing-impaired boy, Caleb, taught her simple sign language phrases, and the Torres twins began sketching her in superhero poses for fun. No one asked her to lead them, but she became their anchor anyway. Not by force, but by consistency, and even teachers started noticing that discipline problems among the more vulnerable students seemed to decrease when Amara was around. But not everyone was pleased. Some parents had begun to murmur about safety, afraid of a student trained in violence, and Principal Hawthorne, despite his efforts to stay neutral, was under pressure to address what they called the incident. A school assembly was scheduled to restore unity, and Amara was invited, not forced, to speak, though the request carried the heavy expectation of apology or at least explanation. The day of the assembly, the gym buzzed with low chatter as the entire student body gathered under flickering lights and a microphone that squealed every few minutes. Amara stood backstage, alone except for the vice principal, who nodded awkwardly and handed her a sheet of paper with suggested remarks, which she folded in half and tucked into her pocket without reading. When her name was called, the crowd quieted, not with boredom but with breath-holding curiosity, because even now no one had truly heard her voice. She stepped onto the stage, adjusted the mic with the ease of someone far older than her 13 years, and looked out, not down, at the sea of faces waiting. She didn't read from the paper. She didn't clear her throat. She simply said, "I didn't come to this school to fight. I came to learn. But when someone pushes you past the line, you have two choices, break or hold your ground. I held mine." There was a pause, long and deliberate, and then she continued, voice calm but firm. "I don't fight out of anger. I defend myself when I have no other choice. What happened wasn't about strength, it was about control. I knew what I could do. I chose not to do more than was needed. That's what my mother taught me. That's what my discipline taught me." The auditorium was still, silent in the way that only deep respect can quiet a crowd. If anyone here ever feels unsafe, unheard, or alone, I see you. And I hope you see me now, not as a threat, but as a reminder that being quiet isn't weakness. It's waiting, it's watching, and sometimes it's power. She stepped back, bowed slightly, and left the stage to stunned applause, not thunderous, not roaring, but sincere, rippling across the room like a rising tide. That moment shifted, something fundamental, not just in the students who had feared or admired her from a distance, but in the faculty, in the very fabric of Ridgeview's culture. Teachers began revisiting how they addressed bullying. The school counselor opened a new peer support initiative, with Amara invited as its first student advisor, and the administration finally cracked down on Bryce and Heather's long history of intimidation, which until now had been dismissed as kids being kids. As the weeks went on, the fame of the video faded, but its echo lingered in how students treated each other, in how Amara became both a legend and a friend, never asking for praise, but never hiding her strength. She walked the halls with the same quiet grace, but now every step she took carried the weight of example, of story, of silent revolution. What began as a planned humiliation ended as a masterclass in restraint, and what they tried to break became a legacy, etched not in bruises or broken phones, but in the memory of every student who watched a girl they ignored stand up, not for glory, but for peace. The world within Ridgeview Middle School didn't transform overnight, but the ripple effect of Amara's calm strength spread wider than anyone had expected, beginning with that quiet yet powerful assembly speech and gaining momentum as students, parents and teachers alike, began reassessing not just their opinions of her, but of each other. As the video continued to circulate throughout the community, picking up traction not just with students, but with local educators, city officials, and eventually even media outlets who asked to interview Amara, requests she politely declined, because fame was never her pursuit, and spotlight was never her home, and still, even without speaking further, she became a symbol of quiet defiance, of restraint, of what true strength looks like when exercised not for ego, but for principle. And though the video eventually stopped trending, its impact lingered like a lesson etched deep in memory. Within the school, something long overdue began to happen. Students who had lived in fear of being shoved into lockers, of cruel taunts whispered down the hall, of being excluded for being different, began to find their voice, not in rebellion or revenge, but in solidarity, sharing their stories not as complaints but as truths long buried. And slowly the culture of Ridgeview began to shift, not dramatically but steadily, like an old building finding a new foundation. It began with small things: teachers listening more attentively, school counselors creating new channels for anonymous reports, morning announcements, including reminders about empathy, respect, and unity. But these weren't hollow gestures. Not anymore, because they were backed by action, by the memory of a girl who had refused to be defined by other people's silence. Principal Hawthorne, once more concerned with image than justice, publicly acknowledged the school's failure to protect students like Amara from bullying before it escalated, and in a bold move that shocked many, he suspended both Bryce and Heather for a full academic week, not just for the ambush, but for the months of harassment that preceded it, citing the school's zero-tolerance policy on bullying and, more importantly, announcing a new restorative justice initiative led, in part by peer mentors, with Amara as the very first person invited to participate, not as a token figure, but as someone whose presence itself taught others that leadership isn't always loud and that courage doesn't always roar. Bryce and Heather, who once walked the halls as self-appointed royalty, returned from suspension different, not entirely transformed overnight, but undeniably changed, quieter, more withdrawn at first, unsure of how to exist in a world where their intimidation no longer commanded fear, but over time something remarkable began to emerge, especially in Bryce, who, after weeks of awkward silences and sidelong glances, approached Amara after class one day, not with arrogance or apology, but with something far rarer among those who once held power: humility. He didn't try to excuse his actions or make small talk. He simply said, "I didn't know someone could be that calm and still win," and Amara, who looked him square in the eye, nodded once and replied, "That's the point," before walking away. And though that exchange lasted seconds, it stuck with Bryce in a way detention never had, prompting him to reflect, to read, to listen, and eventually to become one of the first students to volunteer for the school's anti-bullying task force. Heather's change was slower, less dramatic, but one day she returned a crumpled drawing to a younger student she'd once mocked, now carefully laminated and framed, and said, "This belongs in the art fair." Her voice quiet, eyes not meeting anyone's, and though the gesture didn't undo the past, it opened a new path forward. Meanwhile, Amara continued to walk her own path, still quiet, still focused, but now not alone, as younger students began to gravitate toward her during lunch or after school, seeking guidance, encouragement, or sometimes just the reassurance of being near someone who seemed unshakable. She was invited to speak to sixth graders during orientation week, to share her story, not the fight, but the values behind it, and what she offered wasn't flashy or rehearsed. She spoke of breath, of discipline, of the power of knowing when not to react, and how control isn't about winning fights, but about never needing to throw the first punch. Her words, soft as they were, stayed with those students far longer than any assembly speaker before her, and slowly Amara became more than just a story. She became the standard. She never sought recognition, but she couldn't avoid it. Teachers quoted her in class discussions. Other schools asked to visit Ridgeview to observe their restorative programs, and the district superintendent personally asked to meet her and her mother, whose wisdom and calm, it turned out, was the origin of Amara's poise. Through it all, Amara never changed her rhythm. She still trained each morning before school, still studied hard, still read beneath the oak tree during lunch, and still answered with the same calm, clipped grace she had since the first day. But now people saw her not as mysterious or aloof, but as centered, as powerful in a way that didn't require volume or visibility. In time, the story of what happened in that alley became less about the takedown and more about the follow-through, not just Amara's, but the schools, the students, the communities, as Ridgeview became a case study in how one act of integrity under fire could illuminate the cracks in a system and inspire others to rebuild it, not with rage, but with responsibility. There were still challenges, other bullies who needed intervention, new students who struggled to find footing, but now there was a blueprint, and at its heart was a girl who never raised her voice, never asked for praise, and never tried to prove herself to anyone, because she already knew who she was. And as for the girl they once mocked, she never rubbed her victory in anyone's face, never posted about it online, never bragged because she didn't need to. Her impact spoke for her. Her presence reminded them. Her silence said everything. And in a school once dominated by noise and hierarchy, the loudest legacy of all was left by the one who never had to shout to be powerful.